Yo, I'm sorting through some heinous haters like a pooper scooper. I'm just trying to take my life like a Koopa Trooper. I'm Double Mario, that mean I'm super. And I'm freaking dangerous like a Chupa Cabre. Got them all day like a Kanye, but I'm way better getting cheddar in Monterey. But Jack, you don't know, man. You got the show, man. You want roast beef? Well, I'm artist.
What's up, my wizards? It's Dev, Mtg. We like it in Magic, and today it's time again, y'all's favorite video, the 5 for 5 decks, $5 a piece for Ravnica Allegiance Standard. Perfect for a game night, teaching people to play Magic on a budget, early laddering on Arena, not so bad for that, or even an F&M if your F&M meta supports it. Or, all that said, you could just use these decks for a good old-fashioned fun time, so let's get into it, y'all. Well, last time we did this video, we just did a deck for each guild in Guilds of Ravnica. We're going to do pretty much the same thing here. We're going to do a deck for each guild in Ravnica Allegiance. But that gives us a lot of opportunities to make some really good decks, especially this first one. I like this deck most of all, but that's just because Orzhov is my favorite guild, and I haven't really been shy about that. So let's take a look at $5 Orzhov Afterlife. Now, the old Orzhov have a bunch of creatures at the bottom end of the curve with Afterlife that we can use to make combat complicated for the opponent. We got 4 copies of Hunted Witness, 4 Orzhov Enforcer, 4 Imperious Oligarch, and a playset of Ministrant of Obligation. The Hunted Witness might not have Afterlife exactly, but it's got a form of Afterlife, and it's the best one-drop we can play. Orzhov Enforcer might be the best of all of these cards. Sometimes you want to save this. It's really good in combat. It can hold off a team of 2 or 3 guys by itself, and eventually it can trade up for like a 3 or 4 drop in combat and leave a guy behind on the battlefield. This is a really important card, and it might as well be a slow-rolling Ravenous Chupacabra some of the time. Point is, the card makes for a lot of 2-for-1s, even against cards that are higher up on the curve than it, which you can't often say about Ravenous Chupacabra. You know, this will block a 3 or 4 drop, and yeah, you'll lose your Enforcer, but their guy will always die due to the Death Touch, and you'll get a Flying Dude, which is actually kind of even better than you started with. So there's a lot to like about Orzhov Enforcer. It's one of my favorite Afterlife creatures, period, and definitely one of my favorite creatures in the deck. It just does a lot of work for you. Imperious Oligarch, not quite as impressive in some ways, but still has a keyword ability. Vigilance is nothing to sneeze at, and it's kind of a bear. 2 power, 2 mana, you're always okay with that. This is pretty good in combat, especially when you can get it too, to trade up with like a 3-drop. Nothing wrong with that. But Ministrant of Obligation, we're kind of obligated to play this card in an Afterlife deck. This at least has Afterlife too, so it's going to give us more output than pretty much any other creature in the deck, especially if we can get to sacrificing it. So we're going to play 4 copies of Pitiless Pontiff and 4 copies of Vindictive Vampire to really put Pontiff into overdrive. 2 Ps, 2 Vs. Everybody likes a little P and V action some of the time. So we're going to play both of these because Pontiff is easily our best sacrifice outlet. We're kind of an Aristocrats deck in some ways because of this card. And if we sacrifice a creature that has Afterlife, we're actually getting a lot out of that deal if we have a Vindictive Vampire in play. This is worded really well, even though it costs 4 whole mana. It's kind of worth its weight, you know. If you sacrifice an Afterlife guy, you get a ping off of that. But if you sacrifice the token that leaves behind, you'll also get a ping off of that interaction. And Pontiff's not just a sacrifice outlet, it's also kind of a beast in combat. Yeah, it's only the 2 power, but it's really good on defense, and it threatens well on offense too. Even if your opponent has bigger creatures, they're not usually going to want to block this. It's kind of an Arcbound Ravager situation where if they block it, they're probably going to lose their creature. Yeah, you'll have to sacrifice one of your guys, but we have 16 Afterlife creatures in the deck, so usually we'll get a creature back even if we sacrifice an Afterlife dude. In that case, they'll still lose their big guy, but we'll keep our Pitiless Pontiff, and we'll have a Spirit out in place of whatever Afterlife dude we sacrifice. We really didn't lose any value on board, whereas our opponent did. So very often, they're not even going to go through the trouble of blocking it because it's a huge headache, and they don't want to attack into it either. So this is good whether you're behind or ahead trying to score those last few points. Meanwhile, Vinny Vamps has given us even more reach, providing us 4, 5, 6 drains over the course of a game. And that is a huge difference, especially since you're making up life the entire time. That gives you a lot of extra room to breathe against aggro, and you don't even have to be doing sacrifice shenanigans in order to make this thing work and get some real juice out of it, you know. Just in the normal course of combat, you'll often get 2, 3 drains off of Vampire, and that'll really help you go the distance. But we're actually not done with 4-drop creatures in the deck because we've also got 4 copies of the Fresh Prince of Bellhaunt. Basilica Bellhaunt's actually made a splash in Standard for what it's worth. This is the premier Orzhov creature right now, and you can see why. It just does work against everything. Against slower, mid-rangey, control decks, or even combo decks sometimes. This is going to make them drop an important piece when it enters the battlefield. But against aggro, it gives you a 4 toughness blocking body that also gains you back 3 life when it enters play. So this just gives you an awful lot of action against an awful lot of decks, and it's a solid solid body in and of itself. But the Orzhov Guild, of course, has a really good removal suite too. We've got 4 copies of Final Payment and 4 copies of Mortify. Now, Mortify takes out literally any creature, give or take a hexproof guy here or there. And if you're playing these decks as a box set against one another, which they are tuned to play well against one another, and I get a lot of people telling me that they do that. So if you're doing that, Mortify will take out literally any creature that you come across in any of these decks, and an odd enchantment here or there. It's good to have this much versatility on a card, especially if you plan to play these decks on Arena or at F&M. It's great to have the flexibility to take out enchantments or just any creature that goes bigger than what you're playing, which is an awful lot of creatures. As far as Final Payment goes, it can do the same thing, take out literally any creature, which is pretty sweet. And in this deck, it doesn't make us 2 for 1 ourselves. You know, again, we got 16 Afterlife guys in this stupid thing, so it shouldn't be too hard to sacrifice an Afterlife guy, kill one of their biggest creatures, and not really lose any value on board. Now here's the budget mana base for the Orzhov deck. Of course, with all of these decks, you can spruce up the mana bases, but I'm mostly playing Guild Gates and other tap lands in here to really keep the budget down without sacrificing too much. We still get 15 black sources and 15 white sources. The sources are at parity with one another because very often we have cards that cost both black and white mana, so we want as many sources of both colors as we can. So we've made them directly at parity with one another so that we can get plenty of both. Overall, this Orzhov deck is just your basic kind of mid-range deck that plays a lot of creatures but has a really good removal package too, so we can focus on using that removal package to take out the truly big threatening stuff and threaten small creatures in combat. The real focus here is to take over combat and make it as much of a headache as possible for the opponent as long as we're on the defensive, but to easily go on the offensive and get extra damage from flying spirit tokens and stuff, and then finish things off with vindictive vampire damage. The deck also needs to put multiple pieces in place before it can really thrive. You know, we need an Afterlife guy or 2, and a Pitiless Pontiff, and a Vindictive Vampire before we can really start putting everything into place and playing the kind of Magic that the deck wants to play. But that said, once we do get some of those pieces in play, we start to quickly take over a game, and it's pretty much a shoo-in for us at that point. But on to another guild that's sort of near and dear to my heart, and that's the Rakdos Guild. We're going to hit hard and fast in this deck, and it's basically an aggro deck mixed with a burn deck. But even for about $5, we get a lot of good options at this level. Now we're going to strike fast here with a couple of quick one-drop creatures. 4 copies of Footlight Fiend and 2 copies of Spear Spewer. Now, Spewer can't quite attack for us, but this can virtually guarantee a point of damage every single turn. Even turns where we draw dead, you know, or just turns where we need a little bit of extra juice from our mana. You know, we're able to spend 2 of our mana, but not all 3 of it. So on those turns, Spear Spewer is really good for making sure that we trigger Spectacle. Now, we're not super worried about Spectacle in this deck, to be honest. We only have like 7 different cards with Spectacle, but on turns where we have to trigger it, obviously Spear Spewer is a nearly guaranteed way to do so. Now, Hotfoot doesn't guarantee damage nearly as well as Spewer does, but it's still a really aggressive creature that's very easy for this deck to cast no matter what land you draw in your opening hand, and that's actually really important for consistency's sake. Plus, this can attack into slightly bigger stuff, no problem, because if it has to take out a 2 toughness creature in combat, it can do that, but it can also just ping the opponent, and in this deck, every extra point of damage counts. That's because we basically want our creatures to translate into burn spells in this deck, and our 2-drops are a great example of that. We get 4 copies of Fireblade Artist and 4 copies of Viashino Pyromancer here. Now, Pyromancer is the perfect 2-drop for a burn deck, that much is obvious, but this also triggers Spectacle in this deck really well if we needed to, and isn't a bad top deck at most points of the game, especially if we were able to take big chunks off of their life total up to that point. Fireblade Artist is super aggressive, can attack the turn that it comes down, which is really nice for a deck like this, but can also provide you with tons of reach if it's given a couple of turns to operate. And it's really good with stuff like Footlight Fiend that'll even do extra damage when you sack it. But up to the 3-drops, which is actually pretty much the top of our curve as far as creatures go in this deck. We've got 2 copies of Hackrabat, 4 copies of Rakdos Roustabout, and 4 copies of Blade Juggler, which I'm counting as a 3-drop, but if you play it as a 5-drop, it's totally fine too. You still get a card out of it. We don't get to play anything as impressive as, say, Judith in this slot because we don't quite have the budget for it. If you've already got the Judies at your house, then go ahead and put those in, but cards like Rakdos Roustabout and Hackrabat, for that matter, can be impressive at times. I especially like Roustabout. This can also deal extra damage just free in combat, which is really, really sweet for a deck like this that's, again, it's trying to add up all the damage that it can. Actually, wasn't counting Hacrobat earlier when I mentally counted up all the cards with Spectacle. So I guess we have 9 cards with Spectacle in the deck, but the reason I skipped over it mentally is because you rarely care so much about getting this card with Spectacle. Hacrobat is actually just fine on curve for 3 mana. If you can get it for 2, though, it's a great deal. But pretty much the entire rest of the deck is a pretty familiar burn package. We've got 4 copies of Shock, 4 Lightning Strike, and 3 copies of Skewer the Critics, mostly for budget's sake. They cost about 40 cents a piece, so it's about $1.25 or so in that neighborhood to play 3 copies of this card, and that eats up a fair amount of the budget, but it's obviously worth it. This is one of the best Spectacle cards in all of Standard, and if we can enable Spectacle, a 1-mana sorcery speed, Lightning Bolt, is a pretty good play, especially in a deck that's restricted to the $5 level. Now that's 11 total just straight up direct damage cards, not to mention all of the creatures that can directly deal damage to the opponent like Vashino Pyromancer et al. But we've also got 4 copies of Carnival Carnage in the deck, so that's 4 more cards that can at least hit them for 1 damage in the face, so long as they have a creature or planeswalker out. But the second half is especially good too. This is a burn spell too. Even if your opponent doesn't have any cards in their hand, you can still counter them with hit them with this, target them, and hit them for 3 damage right to the face, enabling Spectacle. Maybe you get to Skewer the Critics after that if you got enough mana. This can just lead to tons of damage, all in one turn, and deny our opponent of their last 2 important resources in their hand. Now here's our mana base here. We've got 21 lands in this deck because the curve is relatively low, but we still work in 13 red sources and 12 black sources. We do need a little bit more red here because all of our burn packages are red and most of our creatures, for that matter, are red. So if you've got the extra lands to put in, things like Blood Crypt, Dragon Skull Summit could really improve things here because the deck doesn't necessarily care for tap lands. But that said, even though we are playing them, we'll usually have untapped sources on the first couple of turns to make sure we get the important plays in. Altogether, this is a very fast aggro deck, especially for the budget that we're kind of stuck at here, Even with the tap lands, this deck can do real work because pretty much every card in the deck does damage directly to the opponent with very, very few exceptions. We add it all up to 20 really, really easily. Like, we're not Modern Burn or anything, but we still do a pretty admirable job at such a low budget of actually hitting our opponent all the way down to 0 with just a fistful of cards. But we're not done, obviously. We got 3 more guilds to talk about, and right now we're on the Grizzly Gruul, and they got some big dudes, in case you didn't know. Plenty of options to put together a sweet mid-range deck that can stop face, so let's check it out. Now, on the early end of the curve here, we've got 4 copies of Llanowar Elves, your best friend in green decks, especially in budget green decks. But we've also got 4 copies of Jurtog Goblin and 3 copies of Kraul Harpooner to kick up the aggression. Now, Harpooner has a pretty good body for the mana cost. A 2-mana 3/2 is not too shabby, especially at this budget of a level. And later on in the game, this functions as a removal spell against creatures that we're bad against. We don't have a whole lot of flying in this deck, so having a creature that's basically a plummet on a stick in the late game, a really nice thing to have. But it attacks for pretty stacked damage in the meantime, and so does Jurtog Goblin. This can either be a 2/2 haste and go ahead and start getting in damage, depending on the situation, or you can wait an extra turn to hit for 3 damage every turn from then on out. Riot is a really good ability to have, especially on smaller creatures like this, because against some controller-type decks, you're going to want to go ahead and start hitting them for damage as quickly as possible if you're facing a deck that doesn't play as many creatures. But against decks that will present threats against you in combat, it's nice to have the biggest creature on the board as early as possible, and Goblin lets you do that. Now, in case we do get a Llanowar Elves on turn 1, we are playing some 3-drops in the deck to drop on turn 2. We've got Rubble Belt Runner and Thrashing Brontodon here. Now, Thrashing Brontodon, about 50 cents a pop, but it's just the best 3-drop we could possibly play in a color combination that's actually kind of light on budget 3-drops that I actually want to play. Thrashing Brontodon has the biggest body of pretty much all of these and can take out rando artifacts and enchantments when we absolutely need to, and that's a powerful ability to have. Aside from that, though, Rubble Belt Runner is a fine body for the casting cost, and it can't be blocked by tokens, which will be important against, say, the Orzhov Afterlife deck every now and again, and a handful of other decks for what that's worth. But at the very least, the CMC is a fine rate for what we're getting in terms of power and toughness. But onto the 4-drops here. We've got 4 copies of Frenzied Arinx and 4 copies of Sunder Shaman, which, as far as bodies go, is way better than Arinx, but Arinx has a lot more sort of versatility on it. The ride on this allows us for either a relatively fast creature, a hill giant with haste is better than nothing. You know, you can come down and surprise opponents, eat up a planeswalker even some of the time, or just take advantage of boards where they've attacked you last turn and left most of their guys tapped down. This can swing the game very quickly if you give it the haste, but even if not, this can just post up, be ready for defense as a 4/4 body, or on subsequent turns, it's a great mana sink. This deck doesn't have a whole lot of ways to use extra mana, especially on turns where it draws dead and it needs to do something with all of its extra lands. Well, Frenzied Arinx is a really good sink when you need it to be that can end up being pretty much the biggest creature in the deck once you pump it. And Sunder Shaman always represents a good rate for a big body. You know, a 4-mana 5/5 has never stopped being a good deal. It may not be as big of a deal as it used to be, but it's still a great rate for the body that you're getting. And this can also break artifacts and enchantments when you need it to, giving this deck a lot of main deck ways of doing that. But if you just get Sunder Shaman through and you don't even have something to break, you're still celebrating. 5 damage to the face is an awful lot. But speaking of 5 damage to the face, we're also playing Charging Monstrosaur here as our 5-drop creature. This thing is only like 15-20 cents right now, and it has always been a pretty reasonable card, especially at the budget level. This thing is a monster. A 5-mana, 5/5, haste, trample. Those are all the abilities that you want. And just like I was saying with Frenzied Arinx, you know, a creature like this with haste can really swing the tide of the game and take advantage of opponents having tapped out the turn before. But we finish up the deck with what spells we are playing here. We got 4 copies of Lightning Strike and 3 copies of Titanic Growth. Now, Lightning Strike is both reach and creature removal. Even a mid-range deck like this, that's going to go above pretty much anything that most people are playing, still needs some form of creature removal to keep stuff off of its back in the early game while it's trying to develop its board against faster decks. But Titanic Growth, anybody who's played the early ladders on Arena anytime recently will know that Titanic Growth will just body you occasionally. 4 damage for 2 mana at instant speed is a crazy rate. And if even a Llanowar Elves gets through unchecked, suddenly we're lava axing our opponent for 5 to their dumb face. So Titanic Growth in a budget build like this is actually a pretty welcome and serviceable card that'll just win the game, or sometimes create these 1-for-1 interactions where your opponent thought they were going to block your Llanowar Elves with their 3/3, but in turn they lose their guy, so you basically play Titanic Growth as a 1-for-1 removal spell. Those are really good situations too, so you'll always find something to do with this card, and it's very rarely dead in your hand. Now this mana base here is a little bit like the Orzhov mana base, 24 lands, and we're at parity as far as sources go, 14 red and 14 green. Overall, the Gruul deck just has the biggest creatures. You know, we got 2 different 5/5s. One of them has haste in this deck. And pretty much every creature on curve is bigger than it really has any business being, you know. We got 3 power 2 drops in this deck. We got 3 power 3 drops, which are at least on curve. If not a little bit above, it's always a decent rate to get a 3 power 3 mana creature. Plus, we go a little bit bigger than that on curve, and we just have these huge dudes. So, if given time to develop our board, we can just go above pretty much every other deck, at least in this box set. But even other decks in the format, you know, there's not a lot of decks in Standard that play a couple of reasonably costed 5/5. So again, if given the proper time to develop the board, we actually do some work even against quote real decks. Well, we've made it to the Slimy Simic, who actually go pretty big too, especially if they're given time to do that. So let's take a look at Simic Midrange here. Now what this actually is a really, really budget take on Adapt, because our most important creatures are Trollbred Guardian and Skatewing Spy here. Both of these are really, really nice payoffs for adapting. You know, Trollbred Guardian will not only give all of our creatures trample that have counters at least, but it's also a really good deal. This is a 5/5, one of the biggest creatures in this whole box set, and it has the potential to get much bigger than that. A 5 mana 7/7, once you pump a couple of more mana into it, is actually a crazy deal. And these cards work pretty well together too if you can get that late in the game to actually have both of these adapted. You know, you'll have a 7/7 flying trample frogman guy jumping through the sky at your opponent, and that'll end games quickly. But even if you don't have a Guardian out, Skatewing Spy can just give like 2 other guys flying, and that just makes this huge difference that ends in you winning the game a lot of the time if you're able to keep your Spy out. But even at this budget level, we have access to a lot of other really good adaptable guys. We got Shark to Crab in the deck, Aeromunculus, and even Sauroform Hybrid, all as play sets. Anyone who has played Ravnica Allegiance Limited will tell you that Sauroform Hybrid is actually one of the best cards in the entire limited environment. It's a bear, so it's just a 2-mana 2/2, fine on raid by itself, but once you're able to pump the mana into it, it's one of the biggest creatures in the limited environment and in this deck at large. Aeromunculus gives us a flying threat outside of just Skatewing Spy, so we actually diversify our plan pretty well in a deck that would usually just have a bunch of ground creatures. You know, you don't think of Simic as a flying guild per se, even with the blue in them. But in this deck, we not only get Spy to give all of our creatures flying, but if we don't have it, we get Aeromunculus to where at least we have a meaty flyer. A 3-mana 2/3 flying, not bad on rate. Honestly, by itself, that's not a bad deal, but once you do adapt it, you've got a pretty chonky flyer, so not bad at all if you don't have a Spy out. As far as Shark to Crab goes, this is actually one of my favorite creatures in this deck because it's not a removal tool, but it feels like a one-turn piece of removal that not only lets you get a guy through against a blocker, but also keeps that blocker tapped down to where it can't hit you on the next turn. So there's a lot to like about Shark to Crab. Aside from that, we've also got a ramp package in this deck. We get to play Lawnmower Elves here too because we should, and 4 copies of Gyre Engineer. There wasn't a whole lot of action at the 3-drop slot that I wanted to play that I really had, budget access to. I'm not saying that you wouldn't play something like maybe Hadana's Climb or any number of other 3-drops in the slot if you had the dough to do so, but when restricted to $5, Gyre Engineer is actually a great piece of ramp that not only helps us get out things like Trollbred Guardian ahead of schedule, but it also gives us that little bit of extra mana that we'll often need to both adapt a creature and play a spell, or maybe just adapt 2 creatures in the same turn. So that extra mana from Gyre Engineer is really important to a deck that's this hungry. Some of the problems in these other decks is that they don't have enough mana sinks. One of our problems is that we actually have too many mana sinks. So Gyre Engineer really helps out with that, and so does Lawnmower Elves. Speaking of mana sinks, we've also got 4 copies of Shapers of Nature in this deck, as well as 4 copies of Incubation Incongruity, which isn't necessarily a mana sink. It just does all the things, For 1 mana, we can get a creature out of the top 5. We'll always find a creature in the top 5 because we're mostly playing creatures in this deck. So this is just a 1 mana card selection tool, and that's a nice thing to have, but it's also a really important removal piece that Simic rarely has access to. As far as Shapers goes, though, this is our Biomancer's Familiar in this deck, and it does allow us to adapt creatures more than once. All we have to do is take a counter off of them and then adapt them again. We also get to draw a card in the process. If we do have extra mana to pump into it, this can give us tons of value over the course of the game, either by making our creatures bigger or by giving us card advantage. Either way, we'll take this. Now, as far as the mana base here goes, it's pretty familiar. 24 lands, but we're actually not at parity quite here in this mana base. We've got 15 green sources, 13 blue sources. We're playing far fewer blue cards in this deck than we are green cards, and I'd really much rather see green sources 90% of the time. Now overall, this deck does what Simic decks do. It doesn't interact with the opponent a whole lot. It's got a couple of ways to do so. Tap that guy down with Shark to Crab, kill your guy with Incongruity. There are ways to interact, but for the most part, we're just trying to do our own thing. This deck goes pretty big if it's given the time to grind and the mana to do what it needs to do. A very hungry deck, yes, but if it adapts all of its guys, it's a real threat. But on to the Zozo. Our last guild of the day is the blue-white, folks, the Azorius Guild, which we actually get a pretty decent $5 budget control deck out of, believe it or not. It's a pretty keen idea. And even though it's the most complex deck of the day, we're not just playing a bunch of 4-ofs in this thing. We're actually doing some deck building here. At the end of the day, we can actually get a real control deck out of this pile. So let's check it out. Now, this deck is operating mostly off of Dovin's Acuity, believe it or not, which I have actually seen in Pro Tour Esper decks playing a few copies of this card. Not a surprise, though, because even though 3 mana is a relatively big commitment, the actual payoff to this is relatively big, 2 extra life every time you get to play the card, plus a drawn card, which is the real attraction here, are incredible upsides to a card like Acuity. So even though it doesn't look super powerful, this can keep us in the game much, much longer, even if we only cast it 2 or 3 times, and it'll draw us into options that'll help us remove creatures and counter even more spells. Now, for building around Acuity for all intents and purposes, then what we need to do is fill the deck with preferably low-cost instants that we don't mind playing on our main phase so much. So to that end, we're going to play 4 copies of Opt, 4 copies of Anticipate, a playset of Revitalize, and 2 Sphinx's Insight. Now, Insight could be Chemister's Insight. You could just switch which Insight you're trusting here, but Chemister's Insight is a little bit more expensive to play and didn't quite make the budget for the deck. That said, though, Sphinx's Insight is a little bit more on theme. Aside from that, the Revitalize, we don't mind playing this on our main phase too much. It's just a couple of mana, draws us a card, and gains us life. And in the early game, this is going to function as sort of a fog type effect, where it almost negates an entire combat step and draws you a card, so it's actually better than a fog effect a lot of the time. As far as Anticipate goes, this will help you draw into important cards like your win condition, more Dovin's Acuity, or even just more counterspells or removal if that's what you're looking for. It's a great selection piece that's also relatively cheap and you don't mind playing on your main phase. But obviously the same thing can be said about Op. Just 1 mana, so you really don't care about playing this on your turn a lot of the time, because 1 mana is almost nothing. That's the next closest thing to nothing. And just drawing a card with the extra scry, not an unpowerful ability either. You know, Op sees plenty of play by itself, so at just 15 cents a pop, it's one of the best commons in the format. You know we're going to play it here. But this deck needs some removal once things do get on board here, so we're going to play 4 copies of Summary Judgment and 2 copies of Law Mage's Binding to start things off here. Now, Summary Judgment is actually a pretty good removal spell, you know? An instant that basically destroys target's small tapped creature isn't bad just to play on your opponent's turn. You can hit creatures as soon as they attack into you. But if you do have an Acuity out and you care about the addendum, then it's not a bad card there either. You know, even if you don't have an Acuity out, sometimes you'll care about the addendum, especially if you're playing these decks as a box set, because you'll end up killing a Shark to Crab or a Sunder Shaman, or Sunder Shaman, excuse me. It's hard to say that fast. A Sunder Shaman or a Charging Monstrosaur. You know, there's all kinds of things that this card can do with addendum. We've also got a counterspell package in our control deck. How novel, right? We got 4 copies of Thought Collapse and 2 copies of Essence Scatter. Now, you may have noticed that none of these decks include sideboards. These are mostly best of one or casual decks, you know. But as far as this deck goes, this is probably the one that you might most want to consider a sideboard. Control definitely benefits the most from having a sideboard. So you might want to play cards like Negate, Disdainful Stroke, Syncopate, whatever, but most of those are sideboard options. I want Essence Scatter in the main deck, however, especially again, if you're playing these decks against one another, you'll have no shortage of creatures to counter, in which case, especially if you went first, Essence Scatter is one of the best cards in the entire deck. But don't sleep on Thought Collapse either. This is a great 3-mana counter, because counter target spell for 3 mana isn't actually the worst deal in the world. It gets a bad rap, but it's not a terrible deal. And the extra value here is okay. We're almost never going to win by milling the opponent, but sometimes we will catch an important option that they'd really like to have drawn. We'll just go ahead and put it in their graveyard, which kind of feels like future removal at that point. But we're not quite done here because we need some win conditions. On the weak end, we have Depose Deploy, but on the strong end, we have Murmuring Mystic in this deck. Now, these work really well together. You know, if you've got a couple of birds out for Mystic, then casting Deploy can gain you a ton of life all at one time. But Depose is a great card draw tool for what that's worth. For only 2 mana, drawing a card is not a bad deal in and of itself. You can tap down one of their creatures to kind of Maze of Ith it and keep it from attacking you, if only for the 1 turn. That can make all the difference, and so can drawing that card. But Deploy can put a couple of extra bodies in play, and sometimes you can ride those bodies to the win. But very often, Murmuring Mystic is what's going to give you the win in these decks. Murmuring Mystic has a great toughness and usually isn't going to be killed by a lot of the removal spells in Standard, and especially in this box set, there's not a whole lot of options against it outside of the things that just kill target creature. But Mystic is a great option as far as win conditions go, because after just a couple of turns of casting spells, drawing card, and opt here or there, a Revitalize, and anticipate into a Revitalize, you know, you can just create a bunch of birds and just call in all at once, hit your opponent for 3-4 damage a turn, and just finish a game off pretty well. So once you have turned the corner and established control of the board, Murmuring Mystic is a great win condition. Now this deck plays 23 lands. That seems pretty short. A couple of lands too short for a control deck, right? But we're playing a lot of stuff that draws cards. You know, we got 4 copies of Opt, we got 4 copies of Anticipate, 4 copies of Revitalize. We're drawing all the cards in the world in this deck. So if you can just hit 2, maybe 3 lands, then the rest will kind of fall in line for the deck. If the deck needs lands and isn't currently flooding out, then it's pretty easy to get the extra lands that you might need. So we actually are afforded a couple of extra business slots in the deck. We don't have to play as many many lands. Even though it is a Dovin's Acuity budget $5 aggro or budget $5 control deck, I wouldn't take it super seriously, obviously, but within this box set, it performs admirably, and it's a very cute deck too. That's a lot of fun to play, and once you actually do get multiple castings of Acuity, you start feeling like a rock star. So at least try the deck out, but I wouldn't take it to a Grand Prix anytime soon. Let me just put it that way. With that, ladies and gentlemen, we have reached our conclusion. 5 decks, $5. Hope you enjoyed it. If you did, make sure you like the video. Really helps me out. A lot of work goes into these, 5 and 10 deck videos. So I really hope that you enjoyed the videos. And if you do, again, please take the time to smash that like button or whatever YouTubers are saying nowadays. Aside from that, you can also click the link in the description, the very first one, and go over to TCG Player. They sponsor my content. And they're where you're going to get these decks for $5 minus the basic lands. I never count the basic lands. I assume you have those lying around. But aside from those, these decks are only about $5 a piece on TCG Player. And I've got them ready as a box set down there in the description for your view and pleasure if you just want to look at all the deck lists. You don't have to order all of them if you don't want to. Just look at the deck lists without having to watch me run my stupid fat mouth for another 20 minutes or however long this took. It's a good venue for that. So make sure you click the link in the description. Go on down over there to Cog Play. But anyway, pretty sure with all that, I'm actually done this time. YouTube pitches in the bucket. So I'll catch you cats later. I'm Dev from the place. Thanks for watching, my wizards. Make sure you spread love and be kind.